This is a second lecturette on conflict. Specifically, this one will focus on conflict management styles, as well as the differences between the styles of compromise and collaboration. Before we get into the styles, let's look a little philosophically at this. Abraham Maslow talks about the law of the hammer. He said if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail, which means that when you get into a conflict situation, since you only have the hammer, you try to look at the conflict as something that you can solve or pound with the hammer. The goal here is to expand the number of tools in your tool belt so that instead of reaching for the hammer, because that's all you've got, you might analyze the situation and think that maybe a screwdriver might be a better way to handle the issue. Most of us rely upon one or two styles. The goal is to give you multiple styles. In 1974, Kenneth Thomas and Ralph Kilman came up with something called the TKI, or the Thomas Kilman Conflict Mode Instrument. They said that you should look at every conflict situation in terms of how important it is for the people involved to get their needs and goals met. So you can look at it from your perspective. How important is it that your needs and goals be met? And let's be realistic. All of our goals are not vital to us. There can be some varying degrees of how important it is for us to get our needs and goals met. And then from our perspective, how important is it to us that the other person involved in the conflict gets his or her needs and goals met? And again, you can range all the way from I really don't care, or in fact, I don't want you to get your needs and goals met at all the way up to, gosh, it's vitally important that you be happy and that you get what you want. So we will plot 5 different styles depending upon how important it is for each individual to get their needs and goals met. Each of these styles has their place. There is no one best way of managing conflict. There may be a preferred way for multiple situations, but there are definitely times that each conflict management style has its place. So we will start with when it's vitally important from your perspective that you get what you want, and you really don't care whether the other person gets what he or she wants. So high concern for your needs and goals being met, and low concern for the other person's needs and goals being met. And we call that competitive. So a win-lose style. I win, I get what I want, and because I get what I want, you can't get what you want, or you lose. This can work when there's really scarce resources like a job or a partner. You are pursuing your concerns at the expense of another. It's sometimes considered highly aggressive communication, hard bargaining. You have to be careful because you can win the battle and lose the war if you use this style. It can really poison a relationship. However, there are definitely times when it's appropriate. In an emergency or crisis situation, let's say the Titanic is sinking, you don't have a whole lot of time to really talk about what would make this other person feel comfortable with our solution. So you may use competitive in this case. When losing could undermine your integrity or your self-respect, then you probably need to consider competitive. Maybe you've tried some other styles and they haven't worked, and this might be a backup style for you. And finally, sometimes there really are scarce resources and there's not enough to go around. Oftentimes divorce situations begin in this manner, where let's say you've got Terry and Pat. They have a cat. Pat loves the cat. Terry could care less about the cat. But in this divorce situation, Terry wants to make sure that Pat doesn't get what Pat wants. So the entire divorce situation could be Terry fighting for the cat because it was important to Terry that Pat not get what he wants. So now we're going to go to the other corner, where it's really important from your perspective that the other person gets what he or she wants, but it's not a big deal from your perspective. So we would call that accommodation, also known as lose-win. I lose, you win. It's non-assertive of individual needs. It's cooperative. It's harmonizing. You as an individual, you put away your own concerns in favor of pleasing the other person involved. Other names for this might be yielding or smoothing or soft bargaining, when you're willing to make one-sided concessions. So when is it appropriate? When the issue or the consequences of the issue are really not important to you. It's also appropriate when it's really important for you to maintain harmony in this relationship, so you have greater concern for the relationship than for the conflict situation itself. If the other person has legitimate authority, your boss, for example, you probably want to accommodate. And then occasionally, I know it happens very rarely, but when you find out you're wrong, it's time to use accommodation. So now we're going to move to the other one, where it's really not important that you get what you want, and it's really not important to you whether the other person gets what he or she wants. So we would call that avoidance, also called lose-lose. Some people might call it withdrawal. This is valued differently for individual cultures. You are withdrawing either physically or psychologically from the situation. You might change topics. You might deny that the conflict even exists. So this can be good on the short term, and on some situations it's good, period. But short term is nice because you can schedule a time later to manage the conflict with a different style. So when is it appropriate? When the issue or the relationship is not important to you, or if other important issues demand your attention, so in the short term or when it really doesn't matter. When it's important to reduce the possibility of physical or emotional harm, sometimes the situation is such that you can't manage it at that point in time other than to avoid it. So if your boss calls you out in a meeting and you're feeling really uncomfortable and you think it's not fair, it might not be the best time to talk about it in that meeting. You may want to address that at a later time. And if you or the other person is overly emotional or unwilling to problem solve, then this would give you time to avoid the situation until you can think through a response. Now we're going to go into the middle, because it's really not a win-win situation, but most scholars will call it a lose-lose situation. Compromise, and they call it lose-lose because in true compromise, both sides give up something important to them. Other words that have been used to describe this style are distributive or negotiation. So it's often expected. If you're buying a car, you may expect that both of you are going to compromise on it. You'll use trade-offs or exchanges. This can be good as an intermediate style as you're working towards a collaborative solution. So when is it appropriate? It's as a temporary solution until you can work on a collaborative solution. When the goals of each party are truly incompatible and you cannot collaborate, then this is going to be your backup style. Sometimes it's important to negotiate in the relationship in order to maintain goodwill. You have to show that you are contributing to it. And another time is when the goals of each party are really not that important. They're only moderately important to them. So just a caution, avoid settling for a compromise when there is a possibility of having a collaborative solution so that both parties can win. So we're going to move from compromise now to collaboration, which scholars will consider win-win. It's also sometimes known as integrative conflict management style. This focuses on the goals of each party and then figures out varieties of ways to meet both of those goals. So you're trying to find a solution that satisfies everyone based upon outcomes. It differs from compromise because in compromise you look for some immediate position that partially satisfies each party. We consider it to be the most constructive way of handling most conflicts. However, it is more difficult than any of the other styles. So when is it appropriate? It's appropriate when the issue is important to you and from your point of view to the other person, as well as from the other person's point of view. When the relationship is important. And then in most conflicts, except when other styles are more important. So this next slide kind of gives you a review of the standard conflict management strategies so that you can see when it's appropriate to use each one, all the way from competitive to accommodation, avoidance, compromise, and collaborative. On compromise, I mentioned that it is viewed often as lose-lose because both people give up something, but it has also been viewed as win-lose, lose-win, because many times when people compromise, it's a turn-taking thing, that I'll win this time and then you can win the next time. Notice that the more concern you have for the relationship, the more likely you are to move up to compromise and collaboration. So, if you really care about the relationship, you may want to start with a collaborative approach rather than starting with competition. If collaboration is so good, why don't people use this approach? 3 main reasons. First is that there's a lack of awareness. We are so used to competition that we don't even think about compromise, and most of us aren't even taught how to. So why don't people use collaborative if it's the one that we recommend for a relationship that you think is important? 3 main reasons. The first is there's a lack of awareness. We are so used to competition that we don't even think about moving to collaboration. In fact, we may think that we are collaborating when in fact we are engaging in compromise. A second one is that emotion often interferes. It's very hard to manage conflict at all productively, much less collaboratively, if your emotions are going all over the place. And thirdly is it requires the other person's cooperation. It's very hard to collaborate when the other person doesn't even want to collaborate. Most people find it very difficult to tell the difference between compromise and collaboration, and that's because sometimes what appears to be compromise is actually collaboration. Here are the main differences. In compromise, you tend to focus on positions or solutions. This is what I want to have happen. Versus in collaboration, you are focusing on the interests. This is what is of value or of importance to me. Rather than focusing on the solution, you start by focusing on needs and goals, and then try to figure out a way that you can meet the needs and goals with maybe a completely different solution. In compromise, each side gives up something important. That's why we sometimes call it lose-lose, or if you say lose-win, win-lose, it's because I gave up something important to me this time, now it's time for you to give up something. And it's not always a 50-50. You might give up more than I give up, but the fact that both of us give up something would mean it's compromise. In comparison and collaboration, you're working together to help address each other's interests. So in collaboration, you might suggest a solution that might benefit the other person in one area but not benefit you, because there could be something else out there that you could do simultaneously that would also benefit you. In compromise, you often come in with a specific solution in mind. Hey, I know how I'm going to solve this problem. Whereas in collaboration, you work together rather than it's my idea versus your idea. But in compromise, it often involves turn-taking. You get what you want this time, and then next time I get what I want. I want Mexican food and you want Chinese food. Well, tonight we'll go to the Mexican restaurant and tomorrow night we'll go to the Chinese restaurant. In comparison, collaboration is often simultaneous activity in solutions, that we can do the same thing together, that we can work separately but we both get what we want. Or we can work together and we both get what we want. In the case of, let's say, going to a restaurant, maybe we can find a place where they serve both Mexican and Chinese food so that I get what I want at the same time you get what you want. Very briefly, how do you work towards a win-win situation? The first is you need to get with yourself and identify your problem and your unmet needs. What is it that you really want? You don't want to get into a conflict management situation and not know, hey, I don't know what I want. I don't know what I need. You need to figure that out in advance. The second thing you want to do is meet with the other person and try to establish a date or a time to discuss it. If you're in true competitive mode, you just want to spring it on them because you don't want them to be able to think about it. But if you are in a collaborative mode, you want to give the person time to ruminate, think about what their problems are or what their views on it are. Then you move to, when you're meeting with that person, you will describe your problem and your needs, and then have the other person describe their problem and their needs. And obviously you want to try to not let your emotions get involved. Then together you want to negotiate a solution. You want to see if you can come up with a solution that will meet both persons' needs. Rather than going into somebody and say, hey, I have a problem, this is what we should do. You want to say, hey, I'm experiencing some problems, can we talk about it? And then when you talk about it, this is what I'm viewing, what are you seeing? They tell you what they see, and then now you start talking about ways that you might be able to manage it. And finally, you may want to follow up on the solution after the fact, because sometimes, even though you've come up with a variety of solutions in the previous stage, you've identified one you're going to do, that solution may not always work. So time to think here. First is, what conflict management style involves both parties giving up an important part of their position? Thinking about yourself, which style is your primary method of managing conflict? And finally, which conflict management style is the best method for all conflict situations? I hope that you can be more productive in your conflict management.